if you're addressing the question, what is the proper price right now and what is the proper price 3 months after, you have to properly specify the price intervals for that. And you have to deal with specifically in conjoint, you have to deal with the realistic market situations.
Coffee's for closers only.
So we've established my proposal is sound in principle. Now we're just haggling over price.
Let's see how much we're going for in eBay.
I mean, it's the same as Dunkin' Donuts. Costs 15 times the price.
Welcome to Impact Pricing, the podcast where we discuss pricing, value, and the clustered relationship between them. I'm Mark Stiving, and today we have two guests, Matt Johnston and Pavel Knorr. Here are three things you want to know about Matt and Pavel before we start. Matt is the CEO of EPIC Conjoint. Pavel's the CTO of EPIC Conjoint. And I had the pleasure of working with these guys on a project a few months ago, and they're both brilliant. Well, Pavel's brilliant.
Agreed.
First, welcome, Matt. How are you today?
Hey, great, Mark. Thank you. And great to be back on. It's a privilege, as usual. I'm delighted to be here with my good friend and EPIC CTO, Pavel.
It's great to have you back. And Pavel, I didn't ask you this before because you haven't been on yet. How did you get into pricing, or how did you get hooked up with Matt?
Oh, that's a very interesting story, because back in the days, I've worked as a software developer in the outsourcing company, and Matt was one of the potential clients that I had to work with and make sure that Matt will be satisfied with the quality of our service. And then actually when we started to work, it's relatively quickly transformed into something more tangible for me and for Matt. And it seems that we found a good match. So in the end of the days, we've decided that I will move from my old-fashioned outsourcing development role to the new position, specifically with Matt. And yeah, that's how it happened.
Yeah, so for our listeners, Pavel is Ukrainian, and yes, he's still in Ukraine 3 months after the war started. We've been talking about how to get him out of there if at all possible. But but there's a lot of outsourced coding that comes out of Ukraine. And so you were part of that team before you joined Matt full-time.
Yes, this is correct. Well, Ukraine was, before the war started, Ukraine was one of the biggest and the fastest growing market for the outsourcing world. So yeah, hopefully Ukraine will get back to this position relatively soon.
Yeah. And so Matt, give us a quick recap. Why did you start EPIC? And then we'll jump into the project that you and I worked on together, you let me help you with.
I'd be happy to. So my background is pricing, actually. I would have headed up pricing with some pretty high-profile telecom companies, O2, Telefonica in Europe. And then I went out to the Middle East and I headed up group pricing for a Qatari telecom group called Ooredoo. And we had operations all over the Middle East, North Africa, Southeast Asia. It was a fantastic experience for 4 years. My primary role there was to bring best practice pricing tools, skills, and processes to the group operations. The operations ranged in size from 600,000 subscribers in Palestine and the Maldives to up to 65 million subscribers in Indonesia. So you can just imagine the gamut of pricing challenges and opportunities we faced. And what I wanted to do was bring conjoint analysis to the pricing governance in the operations, to help inject more, rigor and science into pricing decisions. As we know, pricing can be a bit of an art and a science, but that was the objective. And at the time, there was nothing off the shelf, and that was kind of the genesis for EPIC Conjoint. Thankfully, 5-6 years on, having met Pavel, we figured out that, it's very sophisticated algorithms underpinning conjoint analysis, but we figured out if we could box them off, that complexity and sophistication in the back end, and by putting an intuitive front end on to that box, we could inject much more speed, cost effectiveness, and dare I say it, user friendliness into conjoint analysis, which sounds like a contradiction in terms. Anyone who's been used to doing them with agencies will pretty much attest to that experience. So yeah, that's what. And just to kind of round off what you were asking Pavel about, from my perspective, when I'd written the requirements for the platform, and then I went out and conducted an RFP. And I ran it with an Irish software house, a German software house, a Romanian software house, and a Ukrainian software house, Pavel's. And the tenders came back, and by a long mile, the Ukrainian, driven by Pavel, the Ukrainian tender was, from a professional, from an IT architecture perspective, was head and shoulders above the others, and dare I say, the value was incredible as well. And yeah, that's kind of kicked off then 5 years of fascinating, first early stage of EPIC Conjoint's life.
Nice. Did I just hear you say Pavel is smart and cheap?
Value. I said value. Yeah. I never use the word cheap. As a pricing guy, you never use the word cheap. That's sacrilege.
So that our listeners know this, Matt and EPIC Conjoint were really nice and let me use their software when I created the Conjoint course that's on our university. And I thought it was an amazing piece of software, right? It's super simple to use. And I'd given them a few suggestions. So then they thought that I knew something, which was really nice. And they brought me in to help out with the next project. And so, Pavel, can you tell us what that project was about?
Yep, sure. So actually, one day we've decided to make another step above our conjoint solution. And, when we're doing the typical conjoint, we get the benefit of what is called Bayesian analysis. And the idea of the Bayesian analysis that happens behind the conjoint is that we estimating the utilities on the individual level. So we've asking a bunch of respondents to pass the conjoint study. We're estimating the values on the very individual level. And then we actually thought, well, it is nice to have the aggregated view of what is the overall model of preference for that group of respondents. However, we also believe that among them, there are stable clusters, how we call it, stable segments of the respondents with their very own, maybe niche specific needs. And we decided to try to identify them and search for such group or subsegments or clusters within the audience, because when you have the product development background, for you it's actually quite important when you want to come up with the product lineup, when you're doing the product optimization, because it's fine to get the product which shows the overall quite good results with the aggregated view. However, in the reality, it might end up with the case when you've built the product that platform suggested to be the best aggregated product in the market. However, nobody really needs it because all your market is the several subgroups of the niche customers. So we've decided to take this data, the individual utilities on the respondent level, and run a clustering algorithm on top of them to identify the group of people with the similar needs. Then, since we are really focused on the price elasticity, and our clients mostly they are businessmen and they counting the money, so they really all about the price elasticity, they all about the pricing and purely about the pricing background. So once we identified the people with the common needs, the obvious next question was, okay, so how much they're gonna pay for that? So on top of the clustering algorithm, we've then established the price elasticity measurement for that subsegments. And finally, finally, the step number 3 was the portrait of this customer. So let's say the following. We identified a group of people with the similar needs. Then we've measured their price elasticity to identify how much they're willing to pay for this product. And then finally, since our survey platform quite sophisticated and also capable of conducting conjoint together with some generic questions and asking profiling questions to build this portrait of the customers. So we end up with the third step of our segmentation solution, which then allows you to map the average portrait within the subsegments. It can be geographical, demographical, behavioral portrait of the user. So it's purely about what you're going to ask during the conjoint study, what the type of questions you will include. They will define the portrait that you will have in the end. So the outcomes is basically the stale group of people with common needs, their elasticities, and their average portrait.
Okay, so we're going to go through that again a little bit slower because I loved the answer. I thought it was great, but I'm not sure our listeners were able to follow all that. So we're going to try it one more time. Well, actually, we're going to keep this, but we're just going to go in a little bit more depth. So the first thing I heard you say is we do conjoint analysis and we were great at giving you the average part worth utility. We're great at giving you the average person. And I got to tell you, I live in Reno, Nevada, and in the summer it gets to 100 and in the winter it gets to 30. These are Fahrenheit for you Europeans. And on average, our weather is exactly like San Diego. But that doesn't tell you a whole lot about what clothes to put on when you go outside. And so what you said was, look, we're great at this average thing, but in truth, there's market segments. There's a lot of different people who fill out our surveys, who do conjoint studies, and we know different people have different preferences. So maybe instead of averages, we should focus on the individual segments. Right? And so that makes a lot of sense to me. And what I loved when you guys first started talking to me about this, what I loved is in conjoint, you already have half or 3/4 of the data on who is it that likes what features and what products. And so I thought that was really neat. So Matt, what are you going to add to this? Because you're sitting there saying, "Oh, that up."
Well, this is there's no better time for this, really. When you look at the macro global economy, China's gone into self-inflicted recession, whereby it's chasing a zero rate COVID policy, and it's locked down. It's shut down the manufacturing side. It's shut down the service side. China actually represents nearly 1/5 of the global economy, and Western Europe and the US has benefited from China's cheap production because we've imported China's deflationary price, much lower prices. So that's partly what's driving this inflation surge in this part of the world. Then we obviously have, the hangover effect from COVID, where all the COVID payments and the surge coming from people just kind of catching up has been driving inflation. Now, we have, the energy. I think the headline inflation rate in the US is 8.5% now. The core rate, when you strip out food and energy, is over 5%, I believe. And there's no end in sight. And that's so the very turbulent, choppy waters ahead of us. So the question is, how are these going to manifest themselves in the real economy? In household budgets, in our pockets. And when you think about it, so the US has already started raising interest rates in anticipation of trying to counter the inflation rate and hold it in check. That at some point that's going to start to feed through into the main street. in terms of, credit's going to become more expensive. Possibly, now the talk is about recession. It's not even inflation. We've surpassed that. Reduced demand and inflation. Now we're talking stagflation even. Scary. So what does it mean for pricing, folks? Really, and our hypothesis is that the boom times we've lived through over the last decade since the financial crisis, that has masked, I guess, a price sensitivity. People were spending more liberally, with less discretion, I think. And now, with the threat of a recession and the impact on household budgets and people's jobs and the cost of credit, the concern is that people are going to start to attract and become much more discerning as regards their purchasing. And the interesting thing is, what does that mean from a price sensitivity perspective? People, I think, are going to become much more discerning and much more value conscious when they're making purchases now for the foreseeable future. So companies need to get ahead of this and try and understand, what is the implication for this in terms of their pricing, their pricing models and their price levels. As we head into this.
You just scared me and every listener around. Thank you so much.
Hey, the truth hurts.
But what I want you to do is tie that back to market segmentation and why this new addition to EPIC matters.
Yeah. So look, as Pavel described, we believe most people make purchases based on their needs. What we've seen and in the work we've done with clients, that needs can dictate different willingness to pay and different price sensitivities. As what our hypothesis is, and this is what we actually want to test going forward with a kind of a monthly series of conjoints, maybe using some bellwether products, is to see, in those clusters of customers, those segments of customers, are the price sensitive segments starting to rise or expand? Vis-a-vis the less price segments. Is the mix going to start to change, and if so, by how much? And we want to kind of track this in relative real time, and to see what are the implications for products. I mean, if you look at what's happening on Wall Street, there's been a sell-off in the stock market. There's a sell-off in the bond market. That has never happened before, both at the same time in the same week. What they're looking into a recession, so they're expecting this. They're pricing this into their investment decisions.
Yeah, and so a company who wants to know which of their segments are becoming more price sensitive, in order to do that, we have to quickly start running some price segmentation or market segmentation studies and figuring out what the price sensitivity is, and then practically do that on a quarterly basis just to see what's changing in our marketplace, to understand what's happening in our segments. Does that make sense to you, Pavel?
Yeah, that's actually very correct, and that's what we already understand and plan to validate practically. So the idea is to build a visible use case, especially now. It's super relevant in these times. Actually, several clients already requested a bunch of conjoints. So they coming to us and saying that, well, months ago we raised the prices, and now we see that most probably because of the inflation we will have to raise price one more time, end of June, middle of July, and then they probably will expect another price raise somewhere September, October. So they're super concerned about this, and they want to be ahead of their competitors, because from the one point of hand, inflation is pressuring on you, and you have to react properly to maintain your gains. From the other hand, you need to be still competitive in the market, and that's actually what we hear pretty frequently right now from our clients. So yeah, I would totally agree with that vision. That is very nice if, for example, wearing their shoes, if I have a tool which can quarterly basis tell me that, for example, my low-end segment has risen for another 10% in the price sensitivity, that might be a silver bullet actually for me.
Yeah, it's actually, as you started, we're talking about that, it struck me that there's a really hard problem that's coming up right now. Conjoint does a phenomenal job at helping people understand, are you going to buy from me or from my competition?
Yeah.
Right? It does a really good job at that. I don't think it does as good a job. Matt, don't disagree with me. I don't think it does as good a job at, are you going to buy something in the category or not? And so what happens is, as inflation goes up and incomes don't rise, people are going to start saying, well, I just can't buy anything in that category. It's not yours or your competitors. It's nothing. And so this is a real challenge that people are going to have to try to figure out. Matt?
Yeah, I actually remember the great case study from the financial crisis, the time of the financial crisis, where with cars. So take the car sector, the automobile sector, and some of the more premium, mid to mid premium, like the likes of BMW, they started to reduce their prices. But in actual fact, what Hyundai did was went out, asked the customer, surveyed the customer, listen to the customer, try to understand their needs. And what they realized was the reason why customers or potential customers didn't want to pull the trigger and buy a car was for fear that they were going to lose their jobs within the next 6 to 12 months. So what Hyundai did said, well, look, buy the car and we will guarantee if you lose your job, you can give the car back and we give you your money back, which was credible insight. So this is like thinking outside the box, getting ahead of it, not just relying on, promotions and discounts and your typical pricing mechanics, but instead looking at the broader picture of the customers and trying to understand, what they're facing and what they're thinking, what are their concerns, what are the risks that they're perceiving, and try to react accordingly and to help.
I absolutely love what you just said, Matt, because you actually weren't selling your software there. And the reason I say that is I'm a huge fan of Conjoint. It does a phenomenal job. It's just not the magic bullet that does everything. Oh, yeah. And yes, we have to go out and listen to our marketplace and understand what the problems really are and how we can go solve those. So we're never going to just find the answers in data. We actually have to go listen and know what to ask in our questions. So that was a phenomenal answer. So
welcome.
One of the other things I've seen recently happening in the marketplace is if you go to buy an appliance today, you can't buy a low-end appliance. And the reason you can't is because there's supply chain problems and manufacturers can only make so much stuff. And their attitude is, well, I've got enough people buying all my high-end. Why would I waste time building my low-end? Now, how would I figure that out using segmentation and or just conjoint? And Pavel, I'll let you take a shot at that if you want to try it.
Okay, so that's an interesting question. What we can do to address that? So again, we are starting with the study, which first of all, we'll need to understand. Again, as Matt mentioned it, and as you mentioned it, Conjoint is the good tool to compare yourself against the competitors, but it's not performing that well when it's considering buy or no buy at all. So really what I can say here is that algorithms and all the magic behind the Conjoint is only like 50% of success, because if you collected bad data or from wrong people, you will have nothing as the output, nothing useful for you as the output. So the point here is that we, first of all, need to understand who will be our customer there. So if my case is that I cannot produce low-end appliance, and my assumption that I can focus on the high-end appliance and gain some revenue or gain some market share, then I actually should start with the proper screening in my surveys, in my study. I need to find the people who are willing to get the high-end appliance. I need to build a model for them, maybe find some segments within this audience. But what I also would say is that since we're already asking people about what type of the appliance they're going to buy and screening out everybody who's not going to buy the low-end appliance, it's super interesting to just see on the screen out rate and understand how much people was just screen out because they cannot afford the low-end appliance. And then we can run another study on them. We can see how much of them, and in that study, we will, for example, evaluate without the competitors, just to understand at which price points they will be more or less comfortable to buy that low-end appliance, which then...
Pavel,
yeah.
1 sec. I think you shortchanged Conjoint for just a second, because not only does it do well for us versus our competition, it does really well for people choosing within our product line, right? So if we're offering good, better, best products, we could see who's going to choose which product as they go through that. And then we could watch their behavior. What if we took away the good product and it doesn't exist anymore? Now, what's their behavior look like? Which is pretty interesting.
Yeah, I think in this climate, as we're starting to head into more price sensitive climates where people are really going to apply the principles of value-based pricing. Do I really need this? What value does it bring to me? It's very short-sighted and risky for a seller of a white good, an appliance. In fact, that's one of the products that I think we need to bring in as a bellwether into, because there's a large segment of customers that are coming into the new house market where they'll need to buy, young people, house starters, that they're ignoring. That don't in the boom times of the recent decade would probably have splurged on and said, let's go for the premium model. Going into this uncharted territory where they're not in that mode anymore. So, these appliance vendors need to cater for a broader set of customers and customer segments.
So I think that this is actually a really, really hard problem, right? I don't know the answers to these, because the issue is, if I can only make 100 refrigerators, I could make 30 good, 30 better, 30 best, or 40 best, doesn't matter, right? But what if I could make 100 best and I know I can sell them all? Does it really matter what people choose? And how do I figure out what I should be building? This is a really hard problem, because if I've got infinite supply, I don't have a supply constraint problem, then you're spot on right? Let's go serve that low end customer. If I have a supply constraint problem, now we got a challenge. It's just a really interesting problem.
Mark, but how do you know that you will be able to sell 100 premium products?
That's your problem to figure out using Conjoint, isn't it?
Okay.
Give us a call.
And so that was kind of the whole point is, if I know I have a supply constraint, then how am I going to figure out what decisions people would make if I took away some of their choices?
Yeah, look at that. And this reminds me of the case of the when Audi launched the Q7 back in, I think it was 2006, and they had a supply constraint, but they didn't go out and measure the demand and the willingness to pay. And results or case study subsequently calculates the missed revenue opportunity at about $250 million by Audi undercharging and not taking into consideration that surplus demand, that huge demand for that premium car. So yeah, that's one that always sticks with me. But having said that, Audi were still selling the A3 and the A2, and if there's any sector that segments, well, probably over segments, it's the automobile, right, sector.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting, and I guess if I were to summarize what we just talked about, it would be segmentation's hard. It's really important, and the tool is amazing to help you figure out where your segments are. But you still have to put a ton of thought behind it, right? You still have to have strategy and try to figure out what are you doing, what makes sense. So
yeah. And how you design the survey is important as well. It's, a lot of conjoints we do are very kind of products or service spec oriented. With a needs-based conjoint, you need to think more categorical, or really kind of less of the specs of the product and service, but more of the experience and the more emotional, and trying to capture the more emotional needs or aspects of the product. Safety, occasion, sharing, reward, treats.
Yeah, exactly. Because survey design defines what kind of the questions you then will be able to answer. So if you're designing the survey without keeping in mind what is your final goal and what is the questions you want to address in the end, then you may end up with the model which still measuring quite good the market itself. However, it does not address the questions that you had at first. So yeah, the survey design is still a hard part, and unfortunately, there are no tool that can automatically understand what's in your mind and what is your business strategy. So yeah, it's still a tough part, I would say.
Yeah, it's still, just because you guys have made the process simple doesn't mean that you don't have to think.
Yeah.
No. And that's part. Look at our proposition is it's a full service proposition. So we help the client do the thinking as well. We work hand in glove with the client in designing the survey to make sure it does address the product or pricing question that they have.
Yeah. So we're actually running long, but I'm going to ask one. Actually, I'm just going to say this because I think it's so important, and we haven't said it yet. And the thing that I loved when you guys first started talking to me about using conjoint data for segmentation, the thing I did about that is think about what conjoint is really doing. It's looking at individuals and saying, how much do I value an attribute of a product? And the value of the attribute of a product is a really good proxy for what problems do I have? What problems is that attribute going to go solve for me? And when you do market segmentation, in my opinion, the best thing to segment on is what are the customer's problems? What are the market's problems? And so you guys actually had this data that said, hey, look, we've got this proxy for everybody's market problems. Now, how do we use that for segmentation? And I thought that was just a brilliant insight. So that just excited the heck out of me. And I wish we'd have gotten to that early in the conversation too. So nice.
Yeah, well, look at it. Look, and that's I guess that's the beauty of conjoint. And with conjoint, you can bring in obviously the pricing. That's the kicker for us. We can assess the needs and how we can help address with clients how they can help address the target customers' needs or problems. But we can also, because by the virtue of the fact that it is conjoint analysis, we can then overlay the price sensitivity of that onto that cluster and the willingness to pay. And it's amazing the difference in willingness to pay that you see based on the different needs of the clusters. It's remarkable, and that's smart pricing. That's, if you can act on that is smart pricing.
It really is. I got to say, I'm really impressed with what you guys did with that project. So, and as a quick summary, what they really did was they made it so that you can use conjoint to segment your market based on problems. And then you can figure out price sensitivity for each market segment, which is really powerful. So very, very nicely done. We're going to have to wrap this up. So Pavel, I'm going to give you the final question because Matt's answered it once before. And that question is, what's the one piece of pricing advice you would give our listeners that you think could have a big impact on their business?
Pricing. Okay. So you always should stand on the ground. And here the meaning that I put into this statement is that we quite frequently hearing from our customers that they want to measure the price elasticities on the intervals that is so huge and so unrealistic. So they would barely able even to get the model that represents what they currently have, not even build the prognostic model. And this is very important. So if you're addressing the question, what is the proper price right now and what is the proper price 3 months after, you have to properly specify the price intervals for that. And you have to deal with specifically in Conjoint, you have to deal with the realistic market situation. So you go with the competitor prices, you go with your prices, you go with the potential inflation and counting that. But if you will try to build the too abstract prognostic model, you will just end up with the results that will tell you that it's better to have no model than this one. So that's probably what I will add.
So be realistic in the way we do our design.
Yeah,
which makes a ton of sense. All right, guys, thank you so much for your time today. As always, I love talking to you, and hopefully everybody else did too. And Matt, what's the contact info we want to use for you or EPIC?
Well, probably go to our website, epicconjoint.com. There's a Let's Meet button on the top of the homepage. And we'd be delighted. We'll get back to you very quickly to have a chat and maybe a demo of our latest rapid segmentation solution with the pricing twist.
Nice, I love that. And Pavel, do me a huge favor and do your best to stay safe there in Ukraine.
Yeah, we'll do my best.
Oh gosh, episode 177 is all done. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this, would you please leave us a rating and a review? And please tell your pricing colleagues about the podcast. And finally, if you have any questions or comments about the podcast or pricing in general, feel free to email me, mark@impactpricing.com. Now, go make an impact.